Thank you all for being patient. I really appreciate this so much. We'll get started really quickly. I'll go through some of the housekeeping things. Quick disclaimer that this is not intended to be medical advice or substitute for medical advice. So always seek the advice of a physician and or qualified health provider with any questions concerning a medical condition. So on behalf of the Immune Deficiency Foundation, hello and welcome to our second Get Connected Group member exclusive forum and our 36th virtual forum this year. It's great to see everybody. These forums have come about as a result of you. One of the beauties of this last year is my ability to participate in many of the Get Connected groups and to talk to our community, to learn from our community. And so these topics that we are doing come out of your meetings. These are themes that are coming up constantly. And it's like, and if you have topics that you are interested in, always email me. I think everybody has my email address, and we collect all that and we take that seriously. And so many people have asked about grief. And so, our Get Connected Group forums are different from our regularly programmed forums in that way, in that they really are driven by you, the Get Connected Group, and the participants of it. And so, as someone mentioned earlier, there are different kinds of grief. It's not just grief from the death of a loved one, but you can have grief from the loss of security that many of us have had, or maybe all of us have had. Grief from divorce and loss from that type of loss. And so we can experience grief from all sorts of different things. And so with all that, I would like to introduce our presenter, Ralph Palmer. He holds a Master's of Art degree in clinical counseling and has worked in the behavioral health field for almost 30 years. He specializes in relationship, family, individual, mental health, and substance abuse counseling. Ralph currently works as a clinical supervisor in a residential drug and alcohol treatment program. So please join me in welcoming Ralph Palmer.
Thank you, Brian. So one of the things you've already learned today in managing grief in a pandemic is persistence. So we've had some technical difficulties, but even though you can't see me, hopefully you can clearly hear the presentation today. I do want to thank Brian and the IDF for giving me the opportunity to present today. And I also want to thank all of you who have tuned in. Indicate that there is an important need for discussion about managing this grief in this pandemic, the challenges it presents. And so today we'll talk a little bit about those, and we also will talk about some practical ways of managing grief, things that may not be completely new to you, but maybe just rehearsing if they help us. So I'd like for you to meet Willas and Pansy, alias really Ralph and Mary. So I was saying that he has autoimmune deficiency. She has primary immune deficiency. March, he got sick. The doctor said presumptively COVID because he was no test that early. And then a few days later, she developed the same symptoms, quarantined for about 3 weeks. During that time, her mother got sick and went to the hospital and passed away. And the family ended up having just a small memorial and graveside service when they were used to always having extended family and friends around them during those times. Things went okay during the beginning of the summer, and then the end of July, beginning of August, came home one day from work and had to announce that everyone that I worked with and a number of our clients had already developed COVID-19. And this time a test verified that indeed I did have it. And a few days later, Mary ended up developing the very same symptoms. I went to the hospital due to respiratory problems, came home, and after a few days and within 24 hours, she ended up in the hospital. She had missed her first IVIG treatment in over 5 years. And when she arrived, her lungs were both filled with pneumonia. And the COVID team decided that they need to somehow get her an IVIG treatment if she was going to survive. And with some ingenuity and her help, they were able to do that. And so she did come home about a week later. However, the hospital doctor quarantined Ralph and others an additional 14 days. So now we're off work for over a month. Returned to work only to find out that the company is seriously thinking about closing the program because they lost the clients, they lost a number of staff. Now there's all these concerns of finances and health insurance, how will we pay for it and that kind of thing. So as you see just from that brief encounter, this pandemic is just kind of bang, 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 one thing right after another. And it makes grieving a very difficult thing to do. And learning how to manage that rapid fire is what we kind of want to talk about today. So if we're going to manage something, we really have to know what it is we're managing. And so I want to define grief. We have 4 different definitions here, and then I'm going to make my own up from them. First of all, Webster defines it as deep distress caused by or as if by bereavement. Dictionary.com calls it a keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss. Grief recovery says it's conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And then the Mayo Clinic says it's a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion from the loss of a loved one or from being diagnosed with an illness. So what we're dealing with is deep distress, mental suffering, resulting in a mixed bag of emotions that come and go right and left faster than we can keep up with them sometimes, brought about because of a loss of a loved one or a loss of something important to us, perhaps like a job. It comes about because of a diagnosis we receive. Maybe in the last few months, it's been COVID. Others for us have had a diagnosis longer called primary immune deficiency. And it's changed the way we behave. We do everything differently now than we did a year ago or even 10 months ago. And so grief brings about a lot of emotions. And those are what we want to focus on. So as I was listening on this and proceed today, grief is not just the loss of jobs or health or finances or loved ones. So one of the things we're grieving is a lot of uncertainty in our life. Like how long is this pandemic going to last? Who really knows the truth about the virus? Can I get it more than once? If I have a compromised immune system, what risk does it put me at as opposed to others? And so what we really are grieving is not only uncertainty, but just a real lack of control over our lives. We also are grieving nonverbal communication. You know, we've lost the ability to see each other's face, which is really important when we communicate. So I don't know when you're behind your mask, whether you're smiling at me, frowning at me, or sticking your tongue out at me. We've lost the ability to touch and to hug and We know that touch is a real important piece of helping our immune systems, but we're losing that. We can't shake hands, we can't kiss because of concerns we're going to get or give the virus to each other. And so we're grieving a lack of openness and transparency in our relationships. We're also have to grieve the lack of socialization. You know, we were created to be in relationships with other people. And although we have the advantage of electronic communication, even though as we learn sometimes that can be difficult too, there's a lot we miss out on by not having face-to-face communication at our jobs, with other family members, in our churches, on the sports field, or out in the ball field. And those effects we may not fully understand until months or years down the road. But what we're really grieving is a loss of community as well. Then there's a loss of security. You know, legal restrictions are now being lifted, and so people are having to worry about being evicted from their homes, or having their mortgages foreclosed on, or permanent layoffs from their job, and loss of health insurance, and on the list could go, and you can add your own there. And so what we are grieving is the loss of stability in our lives. And then we also have to grieve a sense of identity, because for many of us, who we are is wrapped up in what we do or what we have. And when we begin to lose those things, we begin to have feelings of low self-esteem, lack of confidence, a lost sense of value and purpose in life. And that all ends up resulting in something called frustration. You know, we all started out this year, I'm sure, with expectations of a great year for better health, better treatments, and now our experiences are something quite altogether different. And the gap between our expectations and our experiences is what we call frustration. And that leads to all kinds of emotions that we have to deal with when we're in the grieving process. So there is a lot of things we're having to grieve all at one time. And we need to learn to manage all those emotions that go with it. So I have a few friends that help to remind me what I need to do from time to time. And so they're gonna help me with this presentation, and you'll recognize them, I'm sure, as they start to pop up on the screen. Winnie the Pooh, one of my favorites. Winnie the Pooh always is in his honey jar, and this time it is empty. And Winnie just says, "Oh, bother." Well, when it comes to all this grief that we're talking about today, that's sometimes how we feel too, isn't it? Oh, bother. Or we just want to poo-poo it. Sorry, I couldn't refuse the pun there. But what it's called in reality is denial. When we start grieving things, denial actually is a good thing, because it helps us to avoid getting overwhelmed so quickly with all the distress and the pressures and all the losses that we're experiencing. And our denial comes out in statements like Pooh's, "Oh, bother," or "I can't believe this is really happening. I can't believe he passed away. I bet they're just making all this up to scare us, and it's probably not as bad as it really is." That's okay for a while, but only a brief period of time. When we enter into another phase of denial, which I call silent denial, which means we're not going to talk about anything, we're not going to admit anything has even happened, that's when things begin to become unhealthy, and we begin to complicate the remaining grieving process. And what we know when we go into silent denial is it can bring on a lot of other issues for us. You know, it decreases our immunity and increases our blood pressure, causes us to be at more risk for depression and anxiety and cancer and blood and other physical things. And so we need to deal with denial. And the way we deal with denial is through acceptance. We must accept this virus isn't going away quickly. We must accept that we are at greater risk from this virus because of our compromised immune systems. We must accept that this is a grave and enduring virus, which we must take precautions to fend off. Wash your hands frequently, wear a mask, social distancing, those things we have heard over and over again. Once we start dealing with our denial, then there's another emotion that quickly comes to surface. Fearful piglet. Piglet is afraid of everything, even his own shadow at times, even though he tries to say to himself, I don't need to be afraid. But Piglet lived in fear of everything. And if we're not careful, this pandemic can cause us to fear everything. We fear over, what if my loved one dies? What if I get sick and I have this compromised immune system? Will they have to stop my treatments? Where will we live if we get evicted? Where do we get food or clothes for the children if we lose our jobs? On and on, our fear can just really run rampant with us. One of the things that I've learned about fear is that we often fear because we have a lack of knowledge. We have a lack of understanding. So if we're going to overcome fear, one of the first things we have to do is learn to educate ourselves. The advantage of technology today, you can go look up anything on the computer. So we need to educate ourselves about the virus. We need to educate ourselves about the virus and how it's going to, our compromised immune systems are going to affect that virus as information comes out. You know, from March until August, when I contracted the second time, there was a lot of knowledge, and there's even more knowledge now. So learn. Secondly, we overcome fear by relying on a higher power. Now, for me, that's God. For you, it could be something else, but we need something outside of ourselves to believe in, to give us strength, to help calm our fears when we're really struggling with it in our pandemic. Then we can also overcome fear by just accepting the love of others around us. We may not be physically together, but we can be together through communication techniques and encourage each other with love and praise. And we can also overcome the negative power of fear by developing an attitude of gratitude for the things that we do know and the things that we do possess. Now, fear, if it's allowed to run rampant, is going to turn into anger. And we're going to become like Mr. Rabbit. Mr. Rabbit was always angry about Pooh or whoever he thought was messing in his garden. And we're not unlike Mr. Rabbit. Because when things or people start messing in the garden of our lives, it will make us angry. Anger is just a natural human emotion that we need to learn to deal with. It's often the loss of a sense of self-empowerment. I get angry because I have lost my purpose in life. I've lost relationships. I just have this sense of being out of control. And when I am angry, I want to blame anybody and everybody I can think of. So often we start with God, saying, well, if he was so great and merciful, he should have been able to keep us from getting so sick and keep this pandemic away. We may get angry at the doctors. Well, if they're so good with their science, why don't they have a treatment already and are curing people? Or we could get angry at the government. Why didn't they give us information long before now about all this? Or we could get angry at our spouse or our children. How dare they go to work or go to school and take the risk of bringing that back knowing I have a compromised immune system. On and on the anger could go. There is nothing wrong with being angry. It's what we do with the anger that may become wrong. To overcome anger, the first thing we just have to do is just be willing to admit I'm angry. I remember having a client in my office some time ago, and he was talking, and you could just tell what was going on in his life was making him so angry, but he didn't want to sound that way. And I actually stopped him and I said, "Man, you sound really angry right now." And his response was, "I'm not angry." It's like I had to laugh. It's like he was denying it verbally, but the tone of his voice told me a whole different story. When we're angry, we have to find healthy ways to deal with our anger. We got to go for a walk, go for a run, go work out in the gym, maybe journal it or draw it out or count to 10, or I'll have to be honest, when I get angry, I have to count to 10,000. Or we need to do something constructive with our anger when that adrenaline kicks in. I was 5, 6 years old at my grandparents at the time. And my grandfather was a woodsman, so he made his living by selling firewood. And he had dumped a load of firewood out over the bank out behind the house. And I got mad at somebody in the house. I don't remember who. And so I went storming out, and I went out there and I started ranking and putting that in a nice, neat pile. At least I thought so anyway. And just as I finished, my grandpa pulled up with another pickup load of firewood. I remember he got out of his pickup and he looked down over that bank at me and he goes, "Who ranked my wood?" And I looked up at him and said, "I did." And his response was, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Because I was angry." And I remember he threw back his head and he gave a big laugh and he said, "Good, because I have another load for you to do now." And that brief encounter at 5 or 6 years old, he gave me a life lesson that when I get angry, my adrenaline will get flowing. Do something constructive with it. It's better to paint a wall than punch a wall, right? It's better to turn on a light than knock off a light. So find something constructive to do physically until the adrenaline burns off. Also, instead of dwelling on what's making us angry, we need to start looking for positive things around us and in our lives. Think about things that you already are blessed with and you already have to enjoy. Look at the beauty of nature. Fall is one of my favorite times because of all the different colors that are exposed. Think about the positive things that you can do for others by praising them, encouraging them. Just when you're angry, learn to practice an attitude of gratitude. If we don't deal with our anger, though, there is some other very serious emotion that follows. Good old Eeyore. I was so upset, I forgot to be happy. Sound familiar? It's called depression. Depression can start off just with a short period of some sadness or loneliness. But if that sadness and loneliness doesn't start improving within 2 or 3 weeks, we could be headed for a very major bout called clinical depression. And lots of things then change in our lives. You know, our appetite changes. We either eat more than we usually do or we eat less. We have the weight change that goes with that. We could be sleeping more, sleeping less. We could give up enjoying activities that kept us going. We would walk away from relationships that could be very helpful. Productivity in our work diminishes. Our ability to concentrate in school diminishes. And people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 have They said, I've lost energy. I've been lethargic. I've had thoughts that I wish I would just die because I feel so bad. And yes, there's even been some who have tried to even plan their own death. If you have never, or you have experienced depression, you know it's a very dark and lonely place to be. But there are ways that we can overcome depression. First of all, you got to develop a daily schedule for yourself. Have a time when you get up and a time when you go to bed and a time for everything in between. Have a time, take time for hygiene, take time to eat meals. And if necessary, seek out professional help. You also may want to begin by practicing self-affirmations. Positive statements you'll say to yourself, but you may not believe it at first, but with time, if you keep repeating it, you'll start to believe them. Could be things like just saying, I believe in myself. I know there's something inside of me that's greater than any obstacle called a pandemic. Or you might want to say, I don't have to control my thoughts, but I don't have to let them control me either. Or you may kind of feel like Eeyore. I am like a gray sky, but I'm still beautiful, even if I don't want to feel that way today. So we have to learn to manage our depression, and I'll come back and talk more about that in a few minutes. So what happens with all these emotions we're talking about is after a while, I just don't want to deal with anybody or anything anymore. And so like Christopher Robin, we tend to isolate ourselves. And we isolate ourselves really to insulate ourselves from greater pain. Now, Christopher Robin often was seen out walking, looking for people, or maybe not. It wasn't people he was looking for. He isolated himself with his imaginary friends that we enjoy today, Pooh, Piglet, Eeyore, and others. He tended to isolate himself in the 100-acre woods from dealing with the realities of his life. That's been one of the big challenges I think we've had to deal with this pandemic, because we keep being told, isolate, isolate, isolate. And if we're not careful, what we do is we insulate ourselves and we block everybody and everything out in our life that could be helping us to get through this pandemic and through all these grief feelings. So let me give some suggestions how to start to break that isolation or insulation going on in our lives. First of all, just seek out some kind of healthy activity for yourself. Just start doing something that will cause you to move your hands and start using your hands. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe it's, starting a new hobby or going back to a hobby you didn't do. Maybe it's crocheting, or maybe it's making model cars. I don't know what it is for you, but start getting your hands moving. Start simple. And then the next thing you do is you start getting your body to move. Get up out of that chair, get out of that bed, and do something that causes your whole body to have to move. It could be, maybe today I'm just going to clean up the mess in my room. Or maybe I just need to go out and mow the yard today and then hide back in my house later. But just do something that starts to re-energize my body, because we know that once our body starts to move, so do the chemicals in our brain, and they can help us naturally defeat depression and other things. Then you start safely trying to connect with other people. You got to begin with somebody you trust. There has to be at least one person in this world you still trust. It could be your partner. It could be your kid. It could be your parent. It could be a best friend, but it's somebody. And what you have to do is you have to just begin to reach out, text somebody, email somebody, call somebody. Or if you're still the generation where you write letters, write a letter to somebody and just tell them how you've been doing and how much you're missing them, and see if, and let them respond to you. And the other thing to break out of your isolation, I suggest today, is develop a sense of awe, AWE. Think about all the awesome things in life. One of the things I reflect back to when I want to think about all is the birth of my children. I got to witness it. And how beautiful it was to think of the miracle of birth and to experience it firsthand with my wife. Or the all of nature. Right now, with the changing of the leaves and the colors, is a great time just to go out and look at all the varieties and take it in. Go for a walk, rustle in the leaves. If nothing else, at least start to look at pictures on Google or wherever you look of landscapes that just kind of take your breath away. And then start to meditate. Start to read spiritual text, pray, whatever you do. And then as you begin to feel safer, go back to community, go back to work, go back to church, get involved in some kind of small group, but begin to break out of that isolation. Well, we've been hammered with all this stuff for the last 8, 9, 10 months, day after day after day after day. And if there's anything I can say today, it's the next slide, please. Tigger's going to come bouncing back into life, folks. Joy will finally come back. The good news is this pandemic will not last forever. It's lasting a lot longer than we want it to. But evidence says that eventually it will go away because other pandemics have gone away in the past. We won't always live in fear of this pandemic. We won't always be angry because of this pandemic. We won't always be depressed because of this pandemic. We won't always feel like we need to isolate because of the pandemic. It will someday go away, and these things, these emotions will lift from us as well. Good grieving happens when we recognize and we deal with all these emotions. And we've tried to give briefly some examples of ways to do that. But one of the things that my life and my faith has taught me is that there is always joy in the midst of our trials. We just have to look for it. And I've used the word joy on purpose today. Happiness is based on the things that are going on around us. And as long as there's a pandemic going on around us, we're not going to find happiness, folks. But I don't have to wait for the pandemic to go away to start experiencing joy in my life. And joy comes when I have a sense of peace and calm and selflessness. And when I connect to a higher power in my life. It comes not from what I have, but from what I can give to others. I can give them praise. I can give them love. I can give them encouragement. And if we keep that in mind, joy will bounce back. And we will once again be whole people. So I have a few last reminders. First of all, grief's a process, folks. It doesn't just come and go away real quick. And when we're hammered with one loss after another, like we have in this pandemic, it's going to linger and get complicated for sure. You know, I've had the privilege of counseling many people over the years who have just wanted to sweep grief under the rug. You know, and one of the ways they've done that is a loved one has died and they've left the clothes lay on the foot of the bed, or the makeup in the bathroom, just the way it was the day he or she died. And now I'm seeing them 20, 30, 40 years later, depressed, anxious, overwhelmed, not sure what to do with their life. It's because they haven't dealt with the grief. We have to deal with the grief. We have to go through the process. We can't ignore it. And the pandemic has given us one source of grief after another in a very short period of time. And so one of my suggestions for trying to manage that process is to list the things that you're grieving and then try to focus on one of them at a time and work through that and then move to another. Just maybe it'll be a way to help start to give you a sense of control. Second, grieving is different for everyone. All of us experience the emotions we have explored today when we grieve. Even if you don't want to admit it, you're gonna have to deal with these feelings. Grief is just a part of life. But none of us deal with it the same way. The way I deal with it is not how you deal with it. The way you deal with it is not the way your partner or your children or your spouse or anybody else is going to deal with it. Everybody has their own different way, their own timing of going through these feelings. And one of the things that happens is I look around me and it looks like everybody else must be done grieving because they're happy and moving on with their life. It's not true. For just now, they might just be in a pause of their grief. So don't believe the lie that everybody else is doing okay and you're the only one suffering still. Everybody has to go through the process. Third, grief feelings come and go at will. These feelings that we talked about today, they bounce in and out whenever they want. We can try to control them. We can do what we want, but they're still, as the process continues, they're going to bounce in and out. You may wake up one day and think, oh, the grief is all over and I can move on now. And later that same day, you become depressed or sad or angry. And it's like, what's going on? It's grief. Remember I said grief is a process. Good grieving takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months. That's if we can process it. If we can't process it, it continues, which is what is happening through this pandemic time. There even comes a time when you may go for weeks or months and not feel like you need to grieve anymore. But there is something we warn people about with their grief, and it's what's called the anniversary year. It's usually the first year, and we also find sometimes it goes into the second year and maybe a little longer when we start looking at all those special events and dates we last shared with somebody. That holiday, that birthday, that vacation we went on together last summer. Or last year this time, I was in the hospital with COVID with double pneumonia. What's important at those times is that we're able to look back and say, at the time I actually experienced that, it was really powerful, but it's less powerful now than it was then. That's our evidence that we're starting to make improvement and we're working through the grief. Also know that grief comes in different strengths, folks. The closer impact someone or someone has on my life, the greater sense of grief I'm going to experience. For example, the power of grief is different for me when I lose my paycheck than when I lose my partner. The power of grief is different for me when I'm told I have a disease that's related to a pandemic as compared to told I'm having a disease called primary immune deficiency. The pandemic will go away. The primary immune deficiency I'll have to live with the rest of my life. Totally different impact on our lives. The other thing to know is grief may require professional help. Hear this. The person who seeks help is not weak, but strong enough to realize they can't do this on their own anymore. And so they learn to ask for help. The help may be going to your doctor and talking about physical symptoms you're having, or depression or anxiety, and talking about medication. Help may be seeking out a professional counselor to sit down and talk with, who may give you some additional ideas of ways to manage it, or just to talk further through it. Professional help may be picking up the phone and contacting your clergy person and asking for prayer or spiritual counsel. The pandemic has changed all of our lives, but the grief associated with the pandemic doesn't have to ruin our lives. You know, there have been some good things that have come out of this. We still can socialize, we just do it at a distance. We can still smile under our mask. We have a higher sense of hygiene and cleanliness than we did before. Some of us have had more time with our partner and our children during this pandemic than we've had in a very, very long time. We can go to work without going to work. We can get an education without going to the halls of the school. We have learned that we're not invincible, but we all are important. We've learned that being together doesn't mean we're physically together. It just means we're here for each other. We can and we will overcome this pandemic. We can and we will overcome the grief reactions to it. May all of us just have the courage, the strength to do that in these days as we wait for it to go away. Well, I want to thank you for your time today. I hope I've shared something that's been helpful. We'll do some questions and answers here. I'll try my best to entertain them. And then my contact information is there if you'd like to reach out for some additional questions or support when the presentation is over today. Ryan, all yours.
Thank you so much, Ralph. As a reminder to participants, if you have any questions, please submit them to me privately in the chat box, and we can get them answered. So the first question I have is, what is the best way to let someone know that they could benefit from professional therapy without offending them?
I think it's, first of all, admitting myself that I've been there or that I'm actually there, and inviting them to maybe go with you, to talk with a clergy person, to talk with a doctor. Remember what I said is people are often resistant because they don't like admitting we're out of control. And so we just have to somewhat let them know, normalize it. It's like, you're not the only one. I'm there. And share our story and how when we've reached out for help. I said, what we got to do is care enough to take a risk.
Got it. So another question, what is the best way to find a therapist or psychologist in a particular area, especially one who understands dealing with a chronic illness?
I often recommend you can start with your insurance company so that you can find a provider that's actually a network, because that's going to be important. You may want to ask a friend that you know went to see a counselor if they have anybody they recommend. Also, almost every county in this country at their local emergency room has access to crisis intervention, which are usually counselors who can help intervene in the most immediate situation, and then they would have all kind of referral sources they could refer you to as well.
Thank you. And we also have, I know, some therapists, I believe, in our database who deal with chronic diseases as well. Another question, Ralph. How can I address someone who does not want to allow me to go through a grief process because she does not want to address her own emotions? It is a relative and entire life. And sometimes it means that I've had to revisit unfinished grief because I am not allowed to finish.
That's one of the reasons I made a comment I did. We all grieve in our own time and our own way. So you need to allow, I mean, if the other person at this point is not ready to actually feel the pain, then, but you may need to just find an outside place to do that. Maybe with a professional counselor, maybe with your clergy person. But don't let someone else stand in the way of your progress and your healing. And maybe if they see you actually go through it and that they see it's not so bad, maybe they'll be ready to do it then as well.
Great. And one of the Get Connected group leaders wrote psychologytoday.com therapist finder. You can filter it by geography, insurance, and interest. And you can, look at hospices, grief counseling for people in your community. So that is psychologytoday.com and their therapist finder. Thank you for that. And a question, I've tried reaching out to people at my church, my pastor and counselor, and received no response. What do you suggest?
Move on. Go find somebody else to talk to. There are lots of people in the community, professional counselors who can talk to you. Look for chat rooms and chat groups on the computer where people are willing to share their stories and hear your story. So there are other places to go. Don't stay stuck with people who don't want to reach out to you. And a lot of times they don't want to reach out or help because they don't know how. They're afraid that they might make you more broken than you are. Or it may be that they're already in their own depression or whatever, that they're just not able to, but they don't want to admit that.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ralph. I think those are the end of the questions there. But we really appreciate you giving your time. Our speakers donate their time to us. And so really special thanks to you, Ralph, for taking your afternoon and joining our group and sharing your insight into the grief journey. Very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We always have these online resources, just so and I think we mentioned that at almost all of the Get Connected groups, but if you want to connect with us online, you can visit our website to access the many resources that we have. And I mentioned this earlier, but the IDF National Summit is coming up November 5th through 8th. And so if you want to register, you can go to the primaryimmune.org website and register that on the event calendar. And I will take your requests for schedules and send that over to the communications department to see if we can get something for you earlier than the Thursday before. And then, most important, thank you to our sponsors. And we have a slew of them here, but they really generously give to IDF so that we can put on these types of forums and stuff. And so just wanted to give a shout out to that group. So I appreciate your time, very much appreciate your patience with the beginning of this. And again, continue to send to me your suggestions. Get Connected group leaders that are on here. You guys are awesome, and you always are keeping me informed. And if you get a theme from your group, send that over to me, and we will put that into consideration and schedule that for the next Get Connected Group Educational Forum. So thank you so much for joining me today. Very much appreciate it. And I will see you at future meetings, I'm sure. Take care.